Awesome. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to everyone here that's decided to get up early and make it to our talk. This is pretty exciting. We're both really excited to be here and to be sharing some of our research. And during this talk, we'll give you a rare insight into a state-sponsored surveillanceware campaign, its operations, and all the context around it. So who are we? My name is Michael Flossman. I head up Lookout's threat intelligence team. I'm joined by Andrew Blaish, who heads up device intelligence. And you might remember us from research into interesting families like NSO's surveillanceware tools for Pegasus, for iOS called Pegasus, and for Android called Cryosaur. And we've also done research into a number of different malware families out there. So late last year, we released a report with the Electronic Frontier Foundation around an actor called Dark Caracal that we ultimately tracked back to a building in downtown Beirut that ended up being Lebanese intelligence, the General Directorate of General Security, or the GDGS. And that part of the world is pretty interesting. We're seeing a lot of threats coming out of there. And as a result, we've done a lot of research into other families that have been active and that have been deployed in the Middle East. So things like Viper Rat, Frozen Cell, Desert Scorpion. And I suppose, it's definitely not just the Middle East where we're seeing a lot of activity. It's probably no surprise for many of you here to know that there's a lot of stuff also coming out of Asia. So we've also reported on in the past about families like XRAT and Titan that have connections to nation-state governments. I won't name names, but check out the reports. So what we're really interested in around all these families is definitely the capabilities of what they're able to do when they're on devices, but kind of more broadly than that, the wider context of who's actually behind them, why are they deploying these tools, so which regions of the world are they using them in, who are they going after, and in some cases, like the one that we'll see today, it's really exciting to come across operational security mistakes from the people running these campaigns where they've kind of tripped up when it comes to securing their infrastructure, and as a result, inadvertently exposed a lot of the content that they've stolen from targets. And that really helps give us a better insight into not only who they are, but who they're targeting as well. So for this particular talk, we'll start off by going back a few years and kind of getting everyone up to speed on this particular actor. It's basically not their first rodeo, so they've been in this game for a long time. They've been deploying Surveillanceware for a number of years. So we'll cover a bit of that before diving into the Android tool called Stealth Mango. And then we'll take a look at the infrastructure, the mistakes they made, and how that resulted in not only a lot of exfiltrated content being publicly accessible, but also in their actual identities being tied to this particular campaign. And one of the other things that we found was that not only were they deploying an Android tool, they also had an iOS capability as well called Tangelo. So we'll go into that before looking at some of the attack vectors that they use to compromise their targets. So back in 2016, Proofpoint and Trend Micro both released reports on campaigns that they each referred to as Operation C Major and Transparent Tribe. And what these were essentially about were they highlighted a long-running Pakistani-based actor that was conducting attacks against members of the Indian government. And some of the things that came out of that was that they were highly successful. They'd been running this operation for a number of years using tools that were designed to compromise both mobile endpoints as well as desktops. And they were really successful despite being pretty low sophistication in terms of techniques and capabilities. So they relied primarily on social engineering, and this is pretty typical. This technique's been recycled it's been in the world for at least 20 years, but it's still highly effective. So what this actor was doing was sending the standard spear phishing playbook type emails to members of the Indian government in embassies in places like Astana and Kazakhstan, as well as Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and essentially enticing people to open an attachment that would result in malware running on their system. So nothing too novel there at all. In conjunction with that, they also had a watering hole hosting a lot of Indian military-themed content, things like pay cuts, accommodation issues, people on trial. And like with the email contents, each of these pages came with a malicious document, and if you clicked on it, you'd have a bad time. A few of the main takeaways that stood out to me, and probably a lot of other people in the research community when reading this, was that they were really successful. They got 16 gigabytes of data from a fairly small target group. It was only 160 victims that were identified. I think my favorite quote here that highlights just how unsophisticated they were was, "This targeted attack campaign is amateur at best, sloppy at worst." Ouch. Shots fired from the researchers at that company, I think. I guess it's no surprise that threat actors sometimes don't read our reports when we put things like that, highlighting their sophistication. So how sloppy is sloppy? Well, turns out it's pretty bad. So not only did these guys have a lot of their exfiltrated content poorly secured on their infrastructure, so anyone could just, if they knew the right URL path, they could access it all. But like a lot of companies out there, they were also dog-fooding their product, which is a little embarrassing when you combine that with having all that content exposed. So they were testing out their own products on their mobile phones and their desktops. And as a result, as we can see here on the right, some of the exfiltrated content included their personal information, and they could be directly connected to that campaign. So kind of awkward for them, no doubt. And as we can see here, there's a screenshot of a conversation with one of the developers called Sajid Iqbal. It has his number, his name, and using that information, we can identify his email address, various domains that he's also registered, using that information. And then also out of this exfiltrated content, there was a direct link to an individual called Faisal Hanif. So moving forward, if we look at what publicly available information can be accessed about these individuals, there's a fair amount of content out there. They haven't really covered their tracks. We can see that Faisal is definitely more active on the infrastructure side of things. He's got a background in VoIP technology and is definitely more responsible for running all domain registration and that kind of thing. And on the right, Sajid's profile pretty much pins him as the app developer, and that's kind of his role. So that you can see that they both worked at a place called Vopium at some point in the past. What's really surprising to me is that, as we saw, their personal information was highlighted in an APT report. They didn't really care. They just kept pretty much going about business as usual. And as a result, we can tie them to the use of commercial surveillanceware tools like AndroWrap, a bespoke surveillance tool called SmeshApp. And then on the shady side of things, they've also been connected to a number of spouseware companies like Ringster, TrackOzy, StealthGenie, The OneSpy. If you're unfamiliar with what spouseware is, it's promoted as a tool that you, as someone in a loving and caring relationship, would go about and install on the device of your partner. So that's what love is. And since then, they've kind of continued to carry on with this kind of development. So their most recent startup is called Super Innovative, and it's got some potentially legitimate work there, like VoIP communication, secure communication, but they're also doing their standard sort of spouseware tool is being offered through this company. And they have some really weird stock photos that don't quite make sense. So outside of that, and really quite recently, what our research focuses on is their latest Android surveillanceware tool called Stealth Mango, and later on in this talk, we'll get to their iOS tool called Tangelo. But first off, just looking at Stealth Mango, I think a lot of the capabilities here are really representative of what you would expect to find in pretty much any sort of tool designed to gather information from targets of interest. So we're seeing functionality like being able to record audio, either when a threat actor triggers and instructs a compromised device to do so, So they can do that at any time. For example, if a target's in a meeting or surrounded or talking to people of interest. It's also capable of recording audio whenever a target device makes a call or receives a call. And then in addition to that, there's functionality that looks for whether WhatsApp is running in the foreground. If it recognizes that it is, it'll try and actually do screen grabs and collect that information as well. And a lot of the other functionality we can see here is pretty stock standard spouseware functionality and surveillanceware functionality, so the ability to track the device location and the rate at which this information is gathered can be tuned and specified by an attacker, so they can make it quite frequent and they can track a target's every location. And then we're also seeing the capability to actually exfiltrate anything on external storage, so things like pictures, images, video, content that a user might have downloaded to external storage. And in addition to this, we're also seeing the capability to exfiltrate device metadata, things like, is a target on Wi-Fi or are they using cellular data? What's the battery level? And these things might seem kind of trivial, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that a lot of this functionality, for example, like knowing how much battery percentage a device actually has, can really help out an adversary when it comes to them determining whether they should, for example, kick off a battery-intensive process like potentially recording audio. So I guess a good example is if a target has, say, 10% battery life, it's unlikely you'd see them deciding to do some sort of battery-intensive process that might tip a target off into knowing that their device was compromised. We also have the capability to record screenshots, also log keystrokes, and collect a lot of personal information such as contact data and associated information, so email addresses, names, the amount of times that calls have been made to these people. So pretty much the main takeaway is that if it's on your device, it's pretty much got access to your key information that an attacker would find useful. In terms of hiding itself, it's, as you can tell, pretty low sophistication. All it does is hide its icon, so nothing too fancy there. And we haven't mentioned anything about exploits. That's because, hey, these guys don't really need it. The bar hasn't been raised high enough for them to actually need to resort to that kind of capability and make those kinds of investments. They've been getting a lot of mileage out of phishing, as have a lot of other actors that we see, simply asking users to enable and allow an app to have certain permissions is often more than enough. And we see this all the time. It's surprising how effective it is. I think one of the ways that the developers behind this actually tried to hide their tool is more definitely low sophistication, but it's focusing on hiding it through attempting to appear like a legitimate application. So if a user goes to have a look at what applications are installed on their device with packages like com.update.system and a app title that's system, I think it's fair to say that a lot of users, when you're scrolling through a wave of applications that are installed on your Android device, you'd probably be a little hesitant to uninstall something like that. And that's kind of like a reoccurring theme we've seen around all the applications that this actor has released. So we've seen 42 known samples as of May. We haven't seen their tooling surface since we released our report. But given previous behavior from these guys, I think it's quite likely we'll see them pretty soon. So just looking at how communication works and how that takes place, as you can guess, it takes place over HTTP, because why not? Maybe that'll change, we'll see. But basically, when a device is initially compromised, it first off sends the device IME, so the device identifier, along with the tag to command and control infrastructure. And these tags are basically associated, they're hard-coded tags, or strings, and they're associated, we believe, to specific campaigns. So it looks like this actor has been running in the past multiple campaigns, each with a specific identifier. So when the server gets this information, it responds with a status message. In this case, it's a 200 OK, user already exists, and then the remainder of the content is around what modules should be enabled. So we can see that things like SMS is set to 1, so it's basically saying, can you enable that module and go about and exfiltrate all that user's text messages. We can see pictures is set to 1, so it's gathering all that content as well. And then in addition to this, there's the instruction to record audio for a really long time, between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., which is interesting to see. And then once this gets kicked back to a client, the infected device actually goes about and handles that. So it responds with its IME first off, text messages, any lat-long information that it can provide with that, followed by call history, a list of packages that have been installed. That's not all the packages, obviously. Had to reduce this down to actually fit it on one slide. But then we're also seeing all that device metadata that I mentioned, so things like how much storage is there, the name of the device, etc. So during this investigation, it was kind of interesting because we're actually able to get limited access to C2 infrastructure, and we could have a look at the scripts that they had created to actually handle a lot of this content. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of comments, and this script was designed to handle requests or post requests being made from infected devices. It's several hundred lines long originally. 80% of those are comments. So it's a bit of a mess, but when we clean it up, it's fairly straightforward. So we can see that these guys have set up a number of different arrays to handle various pieces of user input. They then go about populating all that information into those arrays, and then it's really quite simple. They're just iterating through that all, creating objects that represent each of those pieces of information and saving them to a local database. So message data, text messages, call records, all that information is being inserted into a local database. So nothing too complicated on the back end. Thankfully, a lot of the applications we analyze kind of have a mix of obfuscation. So some malware developers know that their tools are eventually going to fall into the hands of people like us that will try and pull them apart and understand them. And to slow us down, what we see from a lot of them is that they'll use different techniques to make our jobs increasingly more time consuming. In the case of these guys, they didn't do any of that, so it was really quite easy to pull apart. So thanks for saving us time. But what we can see here is a screenshot of their capability around handling text messages out of band. And what that means is that Stealth Mango will process all inbound text messages looking for certain keywords. And if it finds any of those keywords, it will then kick off specific functionality. So in this case, we've got two keywords, start mic bug, that you can see, and m@IC8K. And what's curious about this is that start mic bug is a fairly common heuristic or string sequence, but the other sequence that's highlighted there, out of 50 million applications that we have, it appears only in Stealth Mango and the OneSpy, which is a commercial spouseware tool. So we thought that was more than just a coincidence. And actually, if we go back in time far enough, what we can see is that it looks like at some point the developers behind Stealth Mango forked the OneSpy and started their own development. So that's led to a lot of code reuse. We can see that recorded audio is stored on external storage in the same place in both the Stealth Mango and the OneSpy. But then there's also a lot of dead code that the developers behind the OneSpy were thinking of implementing around about the time that Stealth Mango forked. And that's kind of just sat around in Stealth Mango samples. In the OneSpy, they've gone on to actually implement it. But you can see it doesn't really make sense. In terms of functionality, what I mean by that is that in the Stealth Mango sample and in the OneSpy, we can see that there's functionality to disable texting if a device is determined to be on the road. So if a user's driving, that doesn't really make sense for Surveillanceware. For the OneSpy, Spouseware, potentially. But these aren't the only isolated cases. There's code reuse like throughout Stealth Mango. And there are also a lot of references on the iOS side to the OneSpy, which we'll get into a little bit later. And if we actually take a look for a second at who's behind the OneSpy, it's a company called Oxygen. They're based in Sydney, Australia. But interestingly, they've got developers in Lahore, Pakistan, which will make a bit more sense later on in this talk. So where are they operating from? What does their infrastructure look like? I'll hand off to Andrew to cover that part.
Thanks. Yeah, so we talked a bit about the malware. Now this is the interesting part about where it was talking to, where the servers were located, and kind of how we sort of linked everything together to kind of figure out as much as we could the infrastructure and who was behind this sort of stuff. So primarily kind of a world map. The main server that existed was actually hosted in France. They should be down at this point. If they pop up again, that'll be pretty interesting. But right now they've been taken down at the time of the investigation closed in May. But what was interesting was they had the main server, but what they did was in different samples, they assigned different jump boxes that these samples would talk to. And then those jump boxes would essentially then talk to the main server as well that was hosted in France at one point. So there was a main one that was used, the 158 one that was based in Canada was the primary one that was used most of the time, which is unfortunately not on the map right now, but that's just an error. But most samples use that one, with the few other ones that they were testing around with different functionality to go to different jump boxes in order to track and see how those things are operating. So we look at a little kind of a cleaned up Maltego graph here, a little bit nicerly designed. There's a lot of different domain names that we correlated together with some whois information. So in a little bit, we'll explain what the fi9tech@gmail.com email address means, but basically that's a for-hire development group that is based in Pakistan that does have linkages to all the other people we talked about earlier and some additional people as well later. So at one point either currently during the investigation or in the past to the whois information, we saw that they had used this email address as well as a linkable phone number as well that kind of correlated through all these domains. What was curious that we did notice was that there was a series of things that we talk about where they were actively pursuing the development of iPhone spying tools as well, which when we look at the OneSpy and things, there is capabilities among that, and we'll talk a bit about what the capabilities are on the iOS side shortly. But additionally, they had a lot of other different domains as well that they had developed for not only this surveillance type of work that they were doing, but also they are developers. They do develop apps for other companies because they are contractors that are legitimate, that are not surveillance apps. So but they do intermix a lot of their infrastructure and development and code all across the place. And additionally, though, this was the linkages that we had between another email address that we'll show in a second, which links to all the other people. But these are all the different server IPs that came across as well. They were not behind domains. They were just the IPs themselves that linked in, and then they all essentially funneled into that one main server, which was the main C2 that we conducted our investigation on. Now, what was really interesting about the C2, and Michael mentioned, is that we did have some good insight into some of the exfil that was coming in. Early on in the investigation, they made the mistake of having directory indexing enabled, right? So we could figure out where the exfil directory was, and we could see what things were being collected and get some insight into that. Partially through the investigation, actually, they ended up shutting that down and noticing that should be that was open, and they cut it off. However, as we continued to probe the C2 infrastructure, we noticed that the box, through one way or another, had a WSO web shell on it. If you're not familiar, you might be familiar with it, but if you're not familiar, web shell basically gives you full administrative control over your server through a web panel. However, commonly it does require a login to get in, right? And that would be a violation of CFAA if you tried to guess that. But however, if you can guess a URL, it actually would bypass the login and get you directly into the actual web shell access. And we saw over time as they were At one point it was fully open and they kind of restricted it at certain points and what files would be available, but it did give us good insight into the exfiltration data that was there, where things were being collected from, and then eventually we'll show you kind of where the logins that were coming from for the administrative consoles that were there as well. What was happening though as well is there was kind of a mixture of data that was going to buckets and folders, as well as there was some data that was going to MySQL databases as well, as we saw kind of with the PHP scripts that was collecting a lot more of the textual information and not the media data. Now, we weren't sure whether this was placed by an attacker that was just scanning the internet and noticed the vulnerability and they deployed the web shell, or whether the developers had this habit of trying to use this to administer the systems because they thought there was a login page and there wasn't a way to get past it. Recently, we were probing again some of the infrastructure and we discovered another server by them that had another web shell access box on it. So it might be common that they are using this as their administration tool. What was interesting about this second server though is that there wasn't really any Surveillanceware on it, but it was kind of their development box where they were doing all their other app development, all their testing, all their backend server infrastructure stuff of deploying a number of different apps that are related to a number of different names that they've used, things like Appster Tech, Mobile Care, and Stealth Agent as well that they've been using. So this seemed to be a theme that we were encountering with them as well, which provided great insight into what was happening there. So we talked about that. What were they actually able to get? What did the exfiltrated data look like? So we have some stats and some examples of that kind of data, but highlights, letters and internal government communications. So people like to take a lot of pictures of physical letters that they get and they just store them in their phones, and a lot of that stuff was sucked up by people that were being spied on. Some of those documents were things about travel information on diplomats that were coming in and out of the country. There was a fair amount of picture IDs and passports that we'll get to in a moment that was curious about those. And then a lot of the metadata that we can get out of the pictures, right? So these pictures that were saved were not scrubbed of any of the metadata. So we actually could go through the EXIF data and find out where the pictures were taken in order to give us a bit of insight about where the targets were located potentially. There's a lot of medical documents as well, and also because these were development boxes that were being used, developers dog food their own food, as Michael mentioned. They took a lot of pictures of development stuff, things like all their account emails and passwords for their variant different mobile app store logins and things like that. As well as whiteboard sessions where they were diagramming the server architecture infrastructure and how they were going to do that. So, I mean, they're developers, right? I mean, probably if you work in an enterprise, there's a good chance one of your developers has done the exact same thing. It's just the fact that this was the developers of Surveillanceware that was doing it. So think about that if there's a mobile phone in the room taking pictures of whiteboards. And then finally, there was a decent amount of imagery from military, government, and related officials as well, including some U.S. Army personnel that was, they weren't directly targeted, but because they were in rooms or had communications that went through people that were targeted, kind of got picked up in this sort of thing. Let me go back, actually, if it lets me go back a slide. Yeah, and so the types of exfil data we saw, the majority of the data, the big purple one, if you can't read the text on the bottom, was images. A lot of images that were collected, with the rest of the data kind of being just video and some audio surveillance that was happening as well from our perspective. Now, how much did they get? They got about 30 gigabytes of data before everything kind of shut down. And if you can kind of see those, they were essentially slow rolling this out kind of in December, January. And then sort of in May, it really spiked. They started to deploy it on more devices. We saw a lot more data start to flow in from a lot of different individuals out there as well. So at the end of all of it, there was about 300,000 plus images, as well as 6,000 call recordings, variety of videos, and a couple dozen environmental recordings. Basically means like they, as Mike mentioned, they just hot mic. They just said, hey, phone, record during these hours and go forward from there. It was able to get a lot of data, as we talked about, without any sort of exploits, just simply asking permission, phishing the user, and get it to install. Where was the data located? It was essentially regional around Pakistan. So it was in different types of areas of Pakistan, as well as Afghanistan, India, and a couple over in the UAE as well, as where they were essentially operating, or collect the targets that were being infected with malware. So it was very much regional-based spy that was happening there. Now, as for some highlights of some of the types of data that was there, we had one government communication that had come actually from a US official inviting someone in Afghanistan to come over to the US for a military conference. And at the time that this data had come in, the conference had not happened yet. So this was something that had come in, had gotten taken a picture of, and then exfiltrated up to the server, but had not actually occurred yet at the point in time which we were looking at it. There was also some very blunt communications that had come across where someone was expressing their concerns about a foreign secretary. We saw this in we saw this in the data actually before it went live. So this letter is live. If you try to Google some of the keywords, it will come across. But it did come across in the data that we saw before it actually was a live communication. So there are people taking these pictures that are going on there. But it was interesting to see kind of how blunt some people are in government with their feelings on people. We also had some stuff, this is a little bit redacted, but this was essentially travel information for Australian and German diplomats, who they were traveling with, when they were coming, when they were going, and kind of all that tracking detail that would be going around in the country as well. And that was all sitting up on the server as well. There were pictures of, military weapon shows and artillery stuff that was happening kind of at the Air Force bases there. Internal meetings with a variety of different individuals, different sorts of military patches and things like there, where awards were given, but also essentially closed door meetings that were happening. More closed door meetings with different individuals. We've tried to blur as best we can everything that looked linkable. There were some other sorts of meetings that were happening on a kind of big floor maps that they were using giant sticks to move things around and things, a variety of different areas as well. Different individuals from different kind of governments gathering there. As well as when we talked about the GPS information in pictures, but also they were doing GPS tracking of the devices. This, for example, is a phone that was infected that actually was someone that was traveling into the Ministry of Defense within Afghanistan. So this was kind of their target pool that they were going after. And this is someone that actually did work within there and the GPS information of where they were going. Another interesting thing, and we talked about IDs and passport photos, is that when we looked at some of the metadata on, there was this cluster of passport photos that we saw in the exfil. When we looked at the GPS coordinates, they all essentially mapped over the Kandahar airport, which we thought was very interesting, and they were all essentially Iranian diplomats, I believe, in that cluster that were all taken there. So someone either knowingly or non-knowingly was infected with stealth mango at the time and was taking pictures of these passports. I'm not sure why, but they were, and the data was getting exfiltrated as well up to the C2 server that was there. I'll hand off to Michael to kind of close out a little bit of the identities work.
Cool. So we've seen a lot of reoccurring identities pop up here, and they kind of tend to lead back to this one group based in Pakistan called FI9 Tech. So we saw their email address before, and it turns out that some of the people that have worked for this group have spent time at Voipium, which, if you remember, if we go way back to the public information about some of the key players behind this, they also spent some time there. And pretty much you can see they operate for $50 an hour. This is really cheap to get your hands on these kinds of capabilities, and it's something that we continually see. I think as researchers, we often overestimate what attackers need to do to compromise our endpoints, and there are a lot of low sophistication attacks that we've just seen are still really highly successful. So in addition to people from Voipium having connections to this FI9 Tech group, a lot of them also have history at places like Apsatech, such as Sajid, Oxygen, there's that connection, and then Super Innovative, which we saw earlier. So we've kind of already covered this. Faisal, his role hasn't really changed. He's still responsible for the infrastructure side of things. Sajid, he's still really good at including his personal content and exfiltrated data, as we can see here. So that's a letter of reference from his previous job saying he does a really good job. Hire him. And then he's also including personal information in a lot of the C2 domains, as we can see in the middle in the whois data there. And then the picture on the right is taken from some of the conferences that he talks at as a developer, which could be interesting to go to. And then one of the identities that we haven't yet covered came out of looking at the phishing content that was being used in this campaign. So if the mobile tooling fails, these guys also will try to phish your credentials. So they've set up a number of different pages that look legitimate. As we can see here, we've got a Google sign-in page that might seem legitimate. But if we look at the source code, it's a little awkward. There are a lot of email addresses just littered about. So this person has decided to essentially save this page despite it containing personal metadata connecting to them. And if we search around that, there's a nice little DDoS tutorial on YouTube that actually contains their Facebook ID. And hey, buddy, what's that guy? So where are these people actually logging into these systems from? Enhance. Cool. So as Andrew mentioned, as we have access to some of the key information on the command and control server, we can actually see where admins are logging into these systems from. And in this case, all login connections were coming from the G8 district in Pakistan. This is heavily populated with government buildings. In this case, it says the Ministry of Education is where this IP geolocates to, but I think just broadly, it's worth noting that this entire area is government facilities, so it's that general region, basically. Cool, so we've covered the identities, the Android piece, some of the exfil. We'll just wrap up now with the connection to the iOS side of the house.
Thanks. Yeah, so we talked a bit about the Android piece. Throughout the investigation and the exfil data we looked at, we come back to metadata and we come back to EXIF data, and that is the metadata in the images. We noticed a lot of the images that we saw, a high percentage of them actually, were from iPhone devices. And we thought that was very curious because at the time we only had the Android samples, and we're like, this is interesting. Are they faking information, or how are they trading this data back and forth between phones? Some apps that we would think that they were doing it would be stripping out the EXIF data. So it got us thinking about this, and we kept searching and searching and searching. And eventually we found a sample that linked back to a lot of what these guys were doing. That's called Tangelo, actually, and it actually is called Tangelo in the actual manifest. Now, what's important to note about Tangelo iOS implant is that it's not an app. It's essentially a Debian package that would install on a already jailbroken phone. So in this case, the type of data that they want to get after, they still need a jailbroken phone to go after the device. So, and this is a common approach that we see spouseware makers actually doing, is that they'll say, hey, here's the Android piece, but for the iOS piece, it's better if you have a jailbroken phone and you can install this Debian package and go forward from that. And that kind of flows through a lot of what we know and have seen them develop as well. But it goes after the same types of data, call recording, video, the gallery images as well, audio surroundings, as well as the SMS data, coordinates, blah, blah, blah. And it also specifically goes after similar types of app data that it would get from the shared storage on Android. Things like the WhatsApp data, Viber, Skype, and Line were the four main apps that it was going after within the implant itself. Now, some of the interesting stuff that we saw, obviously the code name was Tangelo that was in there, so that's why we have Mango as the Android side. What we did find and noticing was that the bundle ID, com.mobilecare, which we'll show in a second, does link to other apps that these developers have built in the past for a company called MobileCare. That was some of it was surveillance, but other stuff they were just using as their development bundle ID that was there as well. But from this, we could get the team ID, which helps us track down other apps that they might have developed under this persona and stuff like that. Additionally, though, it had similar heuristics to the OneSpy as we saw on the Android side, further providing that linkage as well on that stuff. But it is important to note that the primary stuff that we did see with the C2 was all Android-based within these campaigns. The Tangelo stuff, it may have been a mixture of development and stuff that they might have used out, because they definitely had a weird structure to their Debian where they had kind of two separate copies of the implant in different folders in the package, but different types of files that were there, some test images as well that they were collecting. What was helpful, though, was that they had left their developer profile in the actual sample that they uploaded to one of their C2 servers, which gives us good insight into who's developing this, what the team ID is, but also additionally, when you share this with the appropriate people, what devices are being used based on those unique GUIDs that are there. So that's further threat intel IOC sharing that can happen to help track down where else these guys are operating and what else they're doing, because this is all registered with the development portal that's there. What kind of footprint did this have on the phone? Basically, it would install in locations that you can only get to if you have a pre-compromised phone. So things like, and actually they would call the app iNotifier. So if you are looking for this in your data set, that's kind of what it would be called. And they would have, they would install things in the launch daemon so that it would launch up when the phone would get rebooted, run the daemons to listen and exfiltrate data, but also a variety of different other runtime installation footprints where they were essentially copying database across the temporary storage in order to read them, process them, and then send them up to the C2 servers as well. Wasn't very sophisticated. This is kind of a common approach you see in this sort of stuff, but this is the approach that they took in this. And then, the kind of the stuff that we saw through, just throwing it into IDA, doing some analysis on it. We see the strings, there are linkages to the OneSpy I've seen here with the URLs and domains that exist, as well as a couple other servers that are not related to the OneSpy that, link back to these developers as well, and their infrastructure that we found there. Another thing was, so you'll see this, the AT identifier in some of these Objective-C methods that they're doing is, this is believed to be a framework that they developed with one of their other companies called AppsterTech. They just essentially abbreviate everything with AT, but it kind of does all of their collection of data and processing stuff. So they developed a framework in order to do all this stuff and helpfully abbreviated it, which is easy to kind of pull out and track and find if you're looking at other samples as well out there. This is just an example of the code that they would do for kind of grabbing the SMS data. Basically, they would just copy the database to another area of the device, process it, and then send it up instead of actually doing any other interesting stuff there. Now, we mentioned some of those C2s before, and we mentioned that they are doing legitimate app development. However, they're sloppy. They reuse their infrastructure in a number of things. And this is one of the apps that they had built that they actually ended up reusing some of their malicious C2 infrastructure for down there. We don't believe the app is malicious. It's actually just using, it's pinging that URL on that C2 server. In this app's case, just to essentially register for push notifications so that they can register and do all the stuff that the app's doing. However, we highlighted in the report and also in here to say, like, they are reusing this. This is used in a malicious case and sometimes. So if it were to pop up kind of in your IDS or something like that, this is the reason why that is there. But they are sloppy. They do reuse a lot of their legitimate infrastructure as well as for their spyware stuff as well. And finally, to kind of wrap up, let's get into attack vectors. How were they actually doing this? And we actually have some interesting images. So what they did was, for the Android side, they set up a fake Android third-party app store. In this case, there is a third-party app store called APK Monk. This is not it, but they did a one-for-one representation recreation of that site. All the links are clickable, but they all redirect back to the same app in the same location. They even have actually detailed information and quote-unquote comments at the bottom to make it look like a legitimate site to get someone to go and click their link. How was this stuff actually delivered? Through long-term spear phishing, right? So they actually set up a profile. One of the names was under the name Sana, and we'll show that in a second, but they would essentially do this, have a conversation with them and eventually get them to go click the link and go forward and install this. And it was highly successful based on the data that we've seen there as well. What is interesting about this persona, and I believe this stuff has been taken down at this point, this actually is a real person's name and a real picture, but the profile that's there, this is not their profile. And there were some reports after the report came out that kind of documented a bit of this, but they had essentially just taken all this information, made their own essentially sock puppet, and used this information so that they can go ahead and phish the attackers out there. And this is what the installation path looks like. In this case, actually, this was an already infected device. Like, how do we have the screenshots? It was an already infected device that was receiving an update to the sample. So they rephished them to get an update on the device. And so we can kind of see what the process would be. And in this case, because there's no new permissions, the user just goes and installs and goes forward through there. But the app itself doesn't really have anything interesting in that once it's launched. And then finally, there was one interesting infection vector where we speculate there was some physical access involved, where based on the names that we saw kind of this package coming to and from a repair shop, that someone may have been operating out of the repair shop, actually installing this on phones and sending it back to them as well in some cases. So you may get your phone fixed, but it comes back with a little something extra, which you may or may not want. So if you send your phone out to repair, maybe do a scan on it before you start it up again. And then finally, as Mike mentioned, they were doing credential phishing as well. They did have Gmail, but they were also doing Facebook credential phishing as well. And then finally, they had several different the APK phishing sites that they were using. They were all hosting them, but they've all been taken down at this point. So they were, we did have an interesting, when we did the takedown initially to get the site off, the developer gets reached out by the people owning the server and they say, okay, malicious stuff has been found, please take this off the site. They literally just replaced it with a different sample, which they didn't actually do anything to change the sample. They just put a new sample up and we just issued another takedown and eventually the whole system went down at that point, which is interesting. So Yeah, so kind of just to wrap up a bit about this with some time there. So we have Android and iOS implants, and important to know, Android we call Stealth Mango. It's also known as Stealth Agent, which was a project that they had also tried to run at some point in time based on indicators that we saw in the server-side code there as well. iOS was Tangelo. And during the course of the active investigation, they were also very active in developing. They were releasing new samples. We saw there was 42 samples that were released in the span of 3 months. They were also very active at updating their server code. They were changing how things are working. They were adding new features. They're developers, right? They're doing QA. They're refining. They're adding functionality based on customer demand, so that they were kind of doing that. As far as targets go, the primary ones really were activists, government officials, and members of the military based in Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Iraq, and the UAE. And the secondary stuff we mentioned, as you saw in some of the images, there was secondary collection from individuals from other countries as well that were out there. And then finally, based on a lot of the linkages we've had with kind of past reports and all the data that we saw in this report and this investigation, we can confidently link it to kind of the group that, a group operating or part of the Pakistani military based on all the other signals that we've seen. As Mike mentioned, they didn't really take much opportunity to hide themselves or change their identities or infrastructure or anything like that. It kind of just is a reuse. They just deployed a different technique at this point in time. And to wrap up, the slides are available, but number of different reports you can read. So we have our full report. It's about 60, 70 pages, has a lot of information if you're interested in learning more about the details. In parallel that this investigation was going on, we got notified that Amnesty was also working on something similar, coming at it from a different angle. So you can also read their report and learn more about that side of the house. And they talked to some individuals that were actually targeted with this directly, so it could be interesting. And if you want to learn more about these actors' prior works, you can read the Trend Micro or the Proof Point reports as well. And with that, if you want to contact us on Twitter or if you have any interesting stuff, please email us. With that, thank you very much, and I'd like to open it up for any questions, or we can chat after. Thank you.